Dear students, welcome to this presentation of Landscapes of the World, Unit 6 and 7. These units are very related with the things that we studied in the previous unit, the 4th and the 5th, because the climate is in direct relation with landscape. Remember, a landscape is the combination of human and natural factors, so vegetation, animals, relief, climate, water, and the human being and their activities. In the world, we can find different landscapes, and they depend directly on the different climates we can find, especially for the natural world, because the animals and plants are adapted to it. As we know, we distinguish three types of zones in the Earth: the temperate zone, cold zone, and hot zone. The hot zone is between the tropics, Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, around the equator. The cold zones are inside the polar circles, the Arctic polar circle at the north and the Antarctic polar circle at the south. And the temperate zones are in between them, between the cold and the hot zones in the north and the cold and hot in the south, temperate zone of the north and the temperate zone of the south. According to that, we can distinguish different kinds of climate. We will start talking about the temperate climates. We distinguish three of them: the oceanic, Mediterranean, and continental. We have already explained them, and now we will focus on other aspects more than just the climate, the vegetation, animals, and human activities that are carried on that areas. Even when we group the different landscapes of the temperate zone under the same tag of temperate, they are actually quite different. For example, these Mediterranean landscapes with hot summers and cool winters, dry and with traditional architecture and activities such as this one in it, or the continental climates we can find inside of the continent much colder with great differences between the summer and winter, and with a specific vegetation such as this coniferous forest, or the oceanic climate at the side of the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans, much humid, greener, wetter, with a more abundant vegetation, like here in New Zealand. We will start talking about the oceanic landscapes. These are called oceanic because they develop at the side of the ocean, especially the Atlantic Ocean, but we can also find it on the Pacific. It's characteristic because it's very rainy. It rains a lot. The most typical landscapes of this oceanic climate show green ground covered in grass and gray skies covered in clouds. For example, this in Scotland. You can find it also in the south of South America, in Chile, like this, or of course in the north of Spain, Galicia, Asturias, the Basque Country, Cantabria, etc. They show constant rain, which is not torrential rain, so they aren't great storms, but soft, continuous rain that cover the land in this thick layer of vegetation. These are the lands in the world that are covered with these oceanic landscapes. Of course, the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, the British Isles, north of France, north of Europe, northwest of Germany, and the north of Spain, and other parts of the world, for example, here in the south of the uh, continents in the southern hemisphere, so southern Australia, New Zealand, and the south of South America. And there are also some other points in the world that even when they do not have this oceanic influence, they are considered oceanic because of their own characteristic. They show very similar features than the oceanic ones. But the most important ones are located between 40 degrees and 60 degrees, so in the temperate zone, north or south, at the west coast of the northern hemisphere because of the flow of the wind that carries the influence of the ocean, and the south coast of southern hemisphere at the very south, where the influence of the sea is much greater. This is a typical climate graph of the oceanic climate. We can see how the precipitation bars are quite high. They have this almost 800 millimeters of precipitation per year, which is quite a lot. It's not an extreme precipitation as we can find, for example, in a rainforest, but it's quite humid weather. They do not vary along the year. They had almost always the same precipitation, and their temperatures, of course, have suffered changes because they have the four seasons like other temperate areas, but they do not have these great variations. So, on summer, they have quite hot weather, which is around 18 degrees, but it's not very hot. And in winter, they have this cold winter around, let's say, 2 degrees, but it's not extremely cold. So the temperatures are mild, meaning that the summers aren't so hot and the winters aren't so cold. The difference between them, the temperature range, is not so high because of the influence of the sea that balance the temperatures. So they have a soft and persistent rainfall, so it doesn't have terrible huge storms, but it rains constantly along the year. The temperatures are mild, not very hot and not very cold. Of course, if we have an oceanic climate more at the north, such as the north of Germany, it will be colder than an oceanic climate at the south, for example in Galicia, which is hotter. But again, they do not have extreme temperatures. The rivers, because of this rainfall, are regular and abundant. They carry a great amount of water all around the year, and they do not change because it always rains in those areas. The typical vegetation of the oceanic climate is the deciduous forest. This is the one in which the leaf became brown or red and fall in autumn. They are very dense forests with a great amount of vegetation because of the abundant rains. When these deciduous forests can't grow, there are still other types of vegetation. Here we can see this deciduous forest in its autumnal aspect. When these deciduous forests can't grow, we have shrubs. So these vegetation, these bushes, dense that cover areas of land, for example, here in South Africa, or like this one. And when these shrubs can't grow either because of the heat, because of the cold, or because the human being has cut them off, the meadows develop. Meadows are these great areas covering grass, which are normally used for the animals to be fed on them. For example, the sheep here in France. And because of the dense vegetation, we can find different animals. For example, foxes, bears, different kind of birds, and boars, typical of this oceanic land. So the vegetation is characteristically the deciduous forest, this one that do not lose the leaf in autumn, the shrublands where these forests can't grow, so these bushes around the land, and the meadows where the shrublands don't grow either, and they are normally used for the herders to be fed. Bears, foxes, boars, birds in the forest, and small rodents and birds on the shrublands, where these great mammals can't live, of course. This area has traditionally been densely populated, especially in Europe, Think that it covers Galicia, Asturias, Cantabria, the Basque Country, parts of Navarra, north of France, northwest of Germany, and almost all of the British Isles. So the human population is very dense. We can see abundant cities like this one in Belgium. That means that the natural environment is reduced, and most of it is humanized landscape. But when the humans aren't quite around, we can find other uses of land. For example, very important for livestock farming. For example, in Ireland with the sheep, which are eating grass from these meadows we commented before. Here we can see the sheep herds in New Zealand, typical of these very large open meadows that, because of the oceanic climate, grow in these lands. Human activity in Western Europe then shows very densely populated areas with large cities occupied by hundred or thousand of years, and when we do not have cities, pastures for the animals to be fed, and fields of corn and potatoes to feed this population. The west coast of North America and the south of South America, we have areas that hasn't been so densely humanized, so we can still find the forest almost intact. And this forest is used for collecting wood, so for forestry. And in Australia, Tasmania, and in New Zealand, we will find cattle and sheep farming, so livestock. The next climate is the Mediterranean one. The Mediterranean landscape is the most familiar for most of us because we can just look through the window and we will see it. It is typical of most part of Spain, excepting for the north that we have said it has this oceanic landscape and the top of the mountains and the Canary Islands. The rest of the Iberian Peninsula has this Mediterranean landscape. Main characteristic is, of course, the Mediterranean climate. As you know, Mediterranean climate is quite hot. It is not in the hot zone, but is the hottest of the temperate ones, probably. It's dry, it doesn't rain so much, and its difference between summer and winter are quite high, especially far from the sea. But they never have such a cold temperatures as, for example, the continental or other climates inside of Europe. It is located, of course, along the Mediterranean, for example, in Greece, but we can also find it in Spain and in other parts of the world that, even when they do not have this Mediterranean Sea on them, they share some characteristics, and for that reason they are called Mediterranean as well. For example, in California. These are the parts of the world where we can talk about this Mediterranean climate. Along the Mediterranean, of course, in the west coast of America, North America, and South America, and in some parts of Australia. Australia is a huge island that has lots of different climates on it. We said here we can find oceanic, and here we can find Mediterranean. So it's on the Mediterranean coast in California, Chile, South Africa, and the South and Southwest Australia. These areas has as a common characteristic that they are hot, they aren't quite humid, but they have some influence from the sea. So they aren't continental, which is the next landscape we will study later. This is a typical climate graph of the Mediterranean landscape. It shows very little precipitation. It's around 500 millimeters. It can be between 300, 500 millimeters approximately. And it's drier in summer, a little bit less precipitation in July and August than in the rest of the months, and it's much hotter in summer. The summers are quite hot. The average of temperature is also quite elevated. And we can see that the average in July is 26, 25, which is quite high for a temperate climate. And the average of the month of January or December, it's around 5 degrees, which is not very cold. So the difference between summer and winter is much greater than in the oceanic one. Here we can see 25, here we can see 5, so a temperature range of 20. 20 degrees as a temperature range is quite high. So they vary a great amount of degrees between the seasons. And it's dry. So if we see a hot and dry climate which has differences between summer and winter, we are probably in front of a Mediterranean climate. So hot and dry summers and mild winters. Winters aren't very cold, are colder but not so cold. The rain in summer is very little and it rains normally in autumn and spring, especially in autumn where we can find torrential rain. This torrential rain is the one that flows extremely in some specific point of the year. It can cause flood or even natural or material damage to the building or to the population that is living there. The river, because of this, are scarce, they do not carry a lot of water, and they are irregular because of the little rain, which is also irregular a lot in autumn and not so much in other moments. The rivers are irregular. This is typical, for example, of the Mediterranean coast in Valencia, for example, where the river can even dry up in summer and then it has a great amount of water that can cause floods. So the opposite, covering the land in water in spring or autumn. They can dry out in summer and can cause flooding, for example, in autumn. The vegetation from the Mediterranean forest is called the evergreen. The evergreen forests are these ones that do not lose the leaves in autumn. They continuously being there on the tree and they continues being green. They have smaller, harder leaves prepared to catch as much humidity as they can because as this is a dry climate, the trees need to have this globular shape in order to catch the rain or the humidity of the air. When this forest can't grow, we will find the bushes. Like the shrubland in the oceanic landscape, we can find the garrigue, which are these very good, very great high bushes, for example, here, or the maquis, which is another surface covering bushes, such as this one in Sardinia. The animals aren't these big mammals that we could see in the oceanic landscape because the vegetation is more scarce. So they need to be smaller. For example, the voles, rabbits, hares, and lizards and insects, typical of this Mediterranean landscape. Vegetation are these evergreen forests, so they are always green, that's the reason of the name. They do not lose the leaves in autumn with thorny shrub. So these bushes have thorns on it. It's a way to be protected. They have dense thickets, dense amounts of small vegetation, bushes, which are the maquis or garrigues, and they have voles, rabbits, hares, reptiles, and insects, etc. Mediterranean areas has been populated for thousands of years. It's the origin of the Greek, Phoenician, Roman, Carthaginian civilization that has flourished all around the Mediterranean. and for that reason they are densely humanized landscape. Even when they have traditional techniques, for example, these agricultural fields with olive trees in Jaén, which is one of the most popular crops growth in the Mediterranean. We can talk about the Mediterranean trilogy, which are the olives, grapes, and wheat, the three main crops that has been the basis of civilization around the Mediterranean. Or even when we use more modern techniques, for example, these greenhouses. This is the sea of plastic we can find in Almeria. And of course, the great attractive of the Mediterranean Sea nowadays is the tourism. Most of Mediterranean shorelines are famous as a tourist destination. So the landscape has changed a lot with many buildings and different activities carried out on the shores. So they cultivate the Mediterranean trilogy. They have intensive farming with irrigation. Remember, irrigation is watering the plants for rice, cotton, and citrus, which are crops that need much more water. And very important tourism in the coastline and for the cultural sites, to the ruins, to the most famous cities. It could be Greece, Rome, Italy in general, Andalusia, and so on. The third and last landscape of this temperate zone is the continental one. The continental landscape, as its own name says, it's inside the continent, so far away from the seas. That's the main characteristic that this climate has. They do not have the balanced influence of the sea, so the temperatures will be extreme, very hot in summer and very cold in winter. You can find it here in the great land masses that do not have this sea influence. For example, inside of Canada or in the center or east of Europe and Central Asia, like this in Ukraine. This is a map of the different types of climate that we group under the name of continental. They can be located here in the great land masses. They are only in the northern hemisphere, as the southern hemisphere in the temperate zone do not have enough land to have these faraway lands from the sea that have no influence from it. So we can find it in north of the United States, most part of Canada, east, central and east of Europe, and most part of central and northern Asia. As you can see, it goes very up to the north, so this continental climate can be very cold. And in sometimes the most extreme cases, it almost looks like a polar climate. But in general, it has some common characteristics. It is in the interior of Europe, Asia, and North America, far away from seas and oceans. The typical continental climate graphs will be this one from Poland. A characteristic that distinguishes quite well these climates is that the wetter months are in summer. We can see May, June, not July in this case, but August, have more rain than the rest of the months. It's not very rainy as it's far from the seas. It do not receive as much humidity, but it's not dry exactly. And the main way to distinguish them are the temperatures. Temperature in summer is quite hot. It's almost 20 degrees, let's say 18. And temperature in winter is very cold, below zero. So this great difference between hot summers and cold winter is the great characteristic of this continental climate because of the lack of great masses of water that can balance temperatures. They have very extreme uh, ranges. So its temperature range in this case will be 18 minus, let's say, minus 6. So it will be a temperature range of 24 degrees, which is quite a lot. And the temperature mean, as we can see, is quite cold. If we go more to the south, it will be hotter. If we go to the north, it will be colder. But they will always have this great difference between climate and these hot summers and cold, normally very cold winters. So extreme temperatures, cold and dry winters because they concentrate most part of the rain in the summer when it is hot. And because of these rains, the rivers hold a great amount of water. It do not rain a lot, but as they are very long areas, the river need to cross them. So they will receive influence from the subsidiaries. So they will receive the water from small rivers that flow into the bigger one, meaning that these very big rivers will carry a great flow and have very long courses. Examples will be the Volga, the Danube, or the Columbia River in Canada. The vegetation is adapted to this characteristic, especially to the cold. They are typically great forests of conifers, so pines. These deciduous trees, they get brown and lose trees on and lose the leaves in autumn, and they are adapted to the cold. We can see these deciduous forests, for example, in Minnesota, the United States. When these forests can't grow because of the lack of water or because uh, some other characteristics, we have the steppes. The steppes are flat areas with very little vegetation. They can be covered in bushes or they can be covered in grass that are normally used for the animals to feed on them. For example, this one typical of Mongolia. The animals from this area are normally big mammals such as the deers and elks, typical of these continental cold forests. So they have this coniferous forest called taiga, this deciduous forest made up of pines and other species of plants typical of cold areas, and when these forests can't grow, we will find the steppes and the grasslands, these large areas covered in grass. Deers, elks, squirrels, and hares, typically as a part of the vegetation from these lands. These areas are open, large spaces. They can be humanized and then they become large crop fields, especially for grain, like these ones in the United States, which are cultivated extensively. So, in a great amount of land with very little people to cultivate it, just some people with machinery, with tractors to collect, harvesters, we collect all of these crops. And in some other areas where the human population hasn't been so intense or the human action is not so noticeable, we still have the forest. And for that reason, they receive the attention of the human in the shape of in forestry. They take the wood from the forest to use it, for example, in the paper industry. These areas do not have as much population, either because of the cold, because they have been populated in later stages of history, for example, the northern of Canada, the northern part of Canada inside of the United States, or Siberia, or because simply the population is not so dense. So they have concentrate settlements where the people live surrounded by large empty areas, like this part of Nebraska, where we can actually see the lands divided in squares geometrically, because as it's a very large land, it has been distributed uh, very clearly in this geometrical shape as a grid. So in the human activity is divided in the taiga, so the forest, where they take the wood for making furniture or for the industries, and they have a small population because it's not suitable for living or for a great amount of people. And in the steppe, they cultivate livestock. Well, they have livestock. They are nomadic herders, such as in Mongolia, for example. They have this extensive grain farming in the United States, for example, or this small concentrated population. This small concentrated population normally in the areas which aren't cultivated for grain. In Europe, we will find all of these three kinds of landscapes, and they depend on latitude. The norther we are, the colder it gets, the souther, the hotter, and the relief. For example, we can find the Mediterranean in all of these parts along the Mediterranean Sea. And for example, in the Iberian Peninsula, it goes up to the very north, but in the Balkans, for example, is stopped by the mountain range, or here by the Alps. So the influence from the sea is stopped by these forms of relief. In this part, west part, north of Spain, part of France and Germany, we can find the oceanic landscape because of the influence of the of the Atlantic Ocean. And inside of the continent, we will find the continental climate. This is a map. The only climates we haven't talked about are the high mountains, the Alps, in the Pyrenees, in the Scandinavian mountains, and the polar in the very north, which share characteristic with the northern pole, and we will explain it. And of course, the subtropical in some islands, such as the Canary Islands. So it has very densely humanized landscapes. Europe has been populated for centuries, so they have a lot of people. That means that the natural space are very reduced. Most of them has the influence of the human being. The natural landscape uh, is influenced because of the latitude. They are located in the temperate and cold zones. They have the influence both from the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and they have the influence of the relief, of course, for the high mountain relief, or for example, stopping the humid wind that came from the sea. When we have finished talking about the temperate climate, we can start talking about the extreme ones. The extreme climates are called that way because they are located in those areas that are too hot or too cold for the humans to live normally. It doesn't mean that there are no people living there, but most of the population in the world lives actually in the temperate zone, or in the closest part to the temperate zone, in the hot one. We distinguish these five climates, five landscapes inside the extreme climate ones. So the equatorial, which are these ones that are along the equator, very hot and very humid. The tropical, which are these ones close to the equator, but that have a specific characteristic because they aren't directly on the equator, but a little farther, so they are not so humid. They can have variation. The hot desert landscape, located, of course, the hot deserts on of the planet. The polar landscape at the very north and the very south, and the high mountains, which is located in those areas over 2,500 meters. The equatorial landscape is characteristic of the places along the equator, which are normally rainforests. These are areas with a very dense vegetation, with a huge variety of biodiversity, and lots of plants and animals and insects living there because of the climate. It's very hot and very humid all along the year. They do not have seasons, they do not vary along the year. They have always the same climate, very hot and very rainy. We can find it in the great rainforest of the world. Of course, the Amazon, but also the Congo and the rainforest of Borneo in Malaysia and Indonesia. These are the areas of the world where we can find this equatorial climate. In the Amazon rainforest, in the Congo rainforest, and in Indonesia and Malaysia. All of it located directly over the equator. Remember that because of the distribution of the sunlight, they receive a great amount of insolation, they do not change through the seasons, and they have a lot of rain. So in the Amazon basin and in Central America, in the Gulf of Guinea in Africa, and in Southeast Asia, which are these equatorial parts. This is a typical climate graph of the equatorial climate. It shows very hot temperatures all around the year. They do not change. Temperature mean is very high, 25.8 degrees, which is very hot. And the precipitation are also very high, and they do not change. We can see that some months rain a little bit more than the others, but they do not have important changes. So it rains a lot, more than 3,000 millimeters, which is a very extreme rain, and it's always very hot. And there are no seasons, they do not change along the year. This is typical of the equatorial climate. So they have high constant temperatures. It's always this hot rainy season. Uh, it's over 25 degrees. They have this heavy rainfall over two or around 2,000 millimeters all year long. And for that reason, they have a high humidity on the air. The air is always very, very humid, and they can suffer from torrential rains. Because of this amount of humidity in the air, just a little decrease in temperatures, for example, during the night, it makes the water on the air to condense and fall in the shape of rain. And because of this great rain, they have some of the highest flowing and most regular rivers on earth. For example, the Amazon or the Congo rivers, which are huge river with an enormous amount of water all year long because it always rains. The vegetation, of course, is very lush, is very dense, very diverse, and it's distributed according to heights because of the sunlight. The sunlight is better on the top, so the biggest trees grow and catch as much sunlight as they can. And then inside the forest is much darker, is shadowy and wetter. So they have shrub vegetation. And under that they have this distribution on layers because it's a competition for the sunlight and only the tallest trees can reach it. Here we can see these huge roots of one of these enormous trees that go up, all the way up to the sunlight over the top of the trees. So it's lush and diverse vegetation with very tall trees as the first level, shrubs and grasses and flowers on the floor level. It has some of the highest biodiversity in the world, but they do not have very big animals because there's such a great competition for resources in this environment that they need to be smaller. They are birds, reptiles, insects, and some small mammals such as the monkeys. There are some people living there, not a lot of them, but there are still some Aborigine tribes or traditional living groups, for example, the Baka pygmies from the Congo or the Yanomamis from the Amazon, that in many cases keep this traditional lifestyle, but the technology has absolutely changed their way of living in many cases. For example, because of the deforestation. Remember that deforestation is lack of forest and lose of forest because of different activities. In this case, for transforming the rainforest in agricultural fields in order to feed the population. Or it can be for the paper industry or for mines or for building infrastructure such as the roads or highways. So there are very small population, very little amount of people normally dedicated to hunt and gather animals or plants in a lifestyle very similar to the one they had in prehistory. Or in some cases, they can have this rudimentary agriculture using, for example, crop rotation, so changing the crops, or putting fire to some part of the forest to burning it and then cultivate on it. But the modern world has influenced them, and many of these parts are substituted by agricultural fields, mines, or infrastructure. Near the equator, but not directly along it, we can find the tropical landscapes. Tropical landscapes are the ones that surround the equatorial uh, landscape. They are between the tropics, Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and they are a wide area with great diversity, climates, temperatures, and vegetation. We can find some of them which are quite similar to the equatorial one, such as this one in Venezuela, or others that are much drier, which are similar to the hot desert. For example, here in South Sudan. The tropical landscape is similar to the equatorial in the sense that it's also very hot and very rainy, but it changed. It has no it hasn't four seasons like in the temperate areas, but they have just two, a rainy season and a wet season. The wet season normally suffers from the monsoon. The monsoon, as we have already studied, is this great amount of rain that uh, covers the tropical lands, especially in the Pacific. These are the lands that can be considered equatorial in darker blue and tropical in lighter blue. It's around the uh, equator. The closer we are to the equator, the wetter it is. The farther we are from the equator, north or south, the drier it is. For that reason, this part will be very similar to an equatorial rainforest, but this part will be quite similar to a hot desert. Between the two tropics, and south, and the further from the equator, the drier the climates are. This is a typical climate graph from this type of landscape. We can see how the temperatures are very high and regular, constant all around the year. They do not have a great variation. The temperature range is very reduced. The line is almost flat, but the precipitation, even when they are very high, it's almost 2000 millimeters. They show two clearly distinguished stages. The one where it rains a lot, from October to May, which is the rainy or wet season, and the dry season, which is the one in which it almost there are almost no rain. Actually, in July, the rain is almost zero. These are the two seasons a tropical landscape have. They do not have difference between hot and cold, but they have difference between dry and wet. Depending on the part of the world we are, this dry season can be in summer, can be in winter, or can be in different moments of the year. So the climate has very high temperatures, a wet season, which is normally in summer, but this can vary, and a dry season, which is normally in winter, but again, this can change depending on our location. The rivers are very variable, and they overflow in the rainy season, meaning that as they receive a huge amount of rain concentrated in a reduced period of time, they overflow, they flood the land. The water goes outside its course. We have already studied one case, which is the one of the Nile. The Nile in Egypt overflows its course and cover the land surrounding it. The vegetation change depending on which part we are studying. If we are in the areas closer to the equator, it is wetter, so we can find this tropical forest, which is very similar to the equatorial rainforest, but it's not so dense nor so diverse. But it's quite similar, especially if we just look at it. But when we are going farther from the equator, we will find drier places. Especially known is the savanna. The savanna is this area covered in grass or bushes with some trees located, isolated along the land because they cannot be together because there are no enough resources, especially water, and it's the area of the long mammals, the large mammals of our world. Important are, for example, the shrubs, these bushes that cover some part of the savanna where not even trees can grow. The animals, of course, are these very big mammals, some of the largest terrestrial mammals in the world, rhinos, gazelles, giraffes, antelopes, and of course their predators, lions, hyenas, or cheetahs, and more animals that we all know. Vegetation from the tropical uh, landscape is tropical forest near the equator, similar to these uh, rainforest. Gallery forest along river, meaning that when they have a river, great amount of vegetation, especially trees, grow that create galleries like corridors of trees. When there are not so much water available, we can find the savanna covered in grasses and shrubs. And when it's even drier, we will find the steppe. This one is not a cold steppe like the one in the continental climate, the one of Mongolia, for example, but it's a hot one. They have this vegetation with hard leaves, thorny shrubs. This is similar to the one in the Mediterranean climate because it's adapted to hot and dry climates, or sometimes just the bare soil, the ground with no vegetation on it, which is found further from the equator, normally in the limits with a real desert. And we can find here the big herbivorous animals and their predators. The human activity in this land can be traditional, where they cultivate the land with traditional methods, especially the crop rotation. So they cultivate different kind of plants in different places in order to achieve the the maximum profit without overexploiting the land or having nomadic uh, herders and nomadic livestock farms. But it's also typical, especially in the wettest areas, these terraces, for example, of rice, that cover every meter of land, trying to get use as much as they can and cultivate great amounts of products. These are great plantations for the people or for selling. For example, rice is adapted to a very wet climate, so it's very suitable for this kind of landscape. And we can also find plantations which are used to sell them to other areas. For example, the cocoa plantation in Ivory Coast, which is uh, prepared for selling the products to other factories for making, for example, chocolate. Human activity in this tropical landscape consists on especially livestock farming carried out in an extensive way. So with huge lands and very loud technology, and agriculture with crop rotation with traditional methods. But in some parts we can also find plantation agriculture whose objective is exportation, so selling the goods to other parts of the world, especially the richest parts of the world. Finally, the hot desert landscape is the last one of the landscape we can find in the hot zone. As these depend on other characteristics, we can find them in other places that do not exactly coincide with the uh, hot zone, but their characteristics are very regular and very clear. The most famous desert is the Sahara, but we can also find the Arab desert, like here, or the Gobi Desert in Mongolia. The Gobi Desert has the particularity of being an interior desert inside Asia, and it's actually a cold desert, not a hot one. Its climate is some sort of extreme continental climate. Or the Atacama Desert in Chile, which is not a sand desert but a rock desert. And it's actually the driest part of the world which is not on the poles. Here we can see the areas of the world who can be considered deserts. We can see how they are, especially in the hot zones, but sometimes they go a little bit up to the north or south because of other characteristics. Those are the hot deserts. So let's say the Sahara, the Arabian deserts, the Afghan and Pakistani desert, the Australian desert, and the ones in the south of Africa, the desert of Mojave in California, Mexican Central Desert, the Atacama Desert in South America. So it's around the tropics. It can be in the hot or it can even enter in the temperate zone alongside cold sea currents. This is very important. The cold sea currents do not allow precipitation to happen, so the water do not go up and there are no rain. For example, in the coast of Africa, we can find a cold sea current near the Sahara Desert and near the Kalahari Desert, and we can see hot, hot sea currents near the rainforest of Congo because the hot sea currents create precipitation and the cold sea currents cause lack of them. Or they can just be far away from the sea, maybe between mountains or something that stops the rains to come. And this is a typical climate graph from a desertic climate. Of course, the precipitation are very, very low. They are below 200 millimeters, and they can be even lower. If we took a climate graph from inside the Sahara Desert or inside of the Australian desert, because this is not the most desertic part of them, the precipitation will be almost zero, below 100, which is very, very, very little rain, almost no rain at all. And the temperatures change. We can see they have a temperature range quite different, quite wide. The coldest month, July, will be 13, 12, and the hottest one, February, will be more than 30. So we have a temperature range of more than 15 degrees, which is quite a lot. But it is always hot. Even when the temperature range is important, we do not find cold months. It's always hot, more or less. We can also notice how the curve of the temperatures is opposite to the one we are used, because the lowest point is on July and June, and the highest point is on December, January, and February. This is because we are in the southern hemisphere, so our summer is their winter and our winter is their summer. So the the hottest point is very, very hot, but the coldest point is quite hot as well. So temperature is always hot and precipitation are very, very low. They have high temperatures with great changes between day and night, because they have no influence from the sea. There are no water at all. They do not have great rainy winds or something like this. So the temperatures can be extreme. They are always hot, but with great difference between day and night, and even some differences between different points of the year. They have little or no precipitation, and they do not have permanent water courses. As it doesn't rain, they cannot have a river. If there was a river, there wouldn't be a desert. There would be an oasis or something. They have wadis, which are the course of a dry river that only fills when it rains. The vegetation is very scarce and is adapted to the conditions. For example, the cacti, plural of cactus, in Baja California, in Mexico, and they have different animals, normally small animals adapted to living in the desert. For example, the cream color courser from the United Arab Emirates, the iguana from the desert of Mojave in California, and this dromedary or Arabian camel, typical from the Arabian desert, and this actual camel, which is the Bactrian camel, uh, which is actually adapted to much colder climates. The dromedary is for hotter climates. The camel can support much colder ones. And the vegetation, there are very few adapted plants, camels, dromedaries, and some nocturnal animals that get use of the cold of the nights to hunt or to look for food. The human population is very scarce, and of course, inside the desert there are no people at all. It's impossible to live there. But on the borders of the desert, we can find nomadic herders, for example, here taking care of sheep, or people that hunts and gathers, for example, the Sand people from the Kalahari Desert, or some others that leads the caravans, like this salt caravan in Niger, or some sedentary agricultures on the oasis. But nowadays, the new technologies have allowed creating different uh, elements on different activities in the desert. For example, mines like this one in India, or even big modern cities built directly on the desert thanks to the money from the oil, such as Dubai from the United Arab Emirates. Human activity then is very scarce. We can find nomadic herdmen, so people that leads the sheep or goats through the desert, sedentary population in oases, which is the plural of oasis, and new constructions financed by oil. Some of the largest exploitation of oil are in the desert. The polar landscape is another extreme climate completely different from the previous one. In this case, it's extreme not because of the great hot, but because of the great cold. It can be found in the very north or very south of the world, close to the North Pole or the South Pole. At the sides of these areas, we can still find population or animals or even plants such as lichens or mosses. But inside of it, it's just a snow desert, like here in the Antarctica. We can find this polar climate here, the northern Canada, Greenland, Iceland, northern Europe and Asia, and the very south, in the Patagonia, south of Argentina and Chile, and of course in the Antarctica, the largest concentration of ice in our planet. We can see other places marked in blue that do not correspond to a real polar climate, but actually to a mountain climate. But because of the height, they are as well cold. It's at the north of the Arctic Circle and at the south of the Antarctic Circle. This is a typical climate graph from the polar uh, landscape. We can see that it's from the southern hemisphere because it gets colder in July, August, and hotter in December, January, and February. But it's always extremely cold. The average temperature is minus 10 degrees, which is extremely cold. All of the months are below zero, so it's always very cold, and it's also very dry because even when we imagine these territories covered in snow, it doesn't mean that it snows every time, because snow is precipitation, and precipitation means water in the atmosphere. But if it's so cold, the water can't remain in the atmosphere because there are no evaporation. So they are actually very dry climates. We can see it has less than 200 millimeters. The reason of why we figure them with a lot of snow is because the snow do not melt. That's the that's the main reason. For that reason, the driest places in our planet are actually in the Antarctica. We can see how it's the coldest in the planet with very little precipitation. There are very few living beings adapted to this extreme climate, and these are mainly small plants such as lichens or mosses or even some flowers. But we still find some animals in these areas called tundra. The tundra is the area covered in some sort of vegetation, but the deep part of the ground is covered on ice. It's frozen, so there are no trees that can grow there, for example. We can find reindeers, we can find birds of different species, and then more at the north, we can only find the aquatic mammals because they are the ones that find food, especially fishes. So we can distinguish the tundra, which is this area covered with some vegetation, and not at the very north, not nor at the very south, that can have bears, reindeers, birds, and aquatic mammals. And then at the very north or very south, we have the true poles covered in a thick ice sheet, which has no life at all. Again, the human population is not used to resist this climate, but there are humans all around the planet. Traditionally, this was the territory of the Inuit, uh, who feed from fishes, like here, or from the Southland, south of Chile, or the Sami in the north of Finland, adapted to live in these tundras, never in the colder parts of the world, never in the poles, because this is impossible as there are no food there. Now, new technologies allow people to go deeper in these colder deserts. For example, the Antarctic military and scientific base, such as this Spanish one, the Juan Carlos I base, which is in the coast of the Antarctica. So, human activity traditionally was carried out on hunting and fishing communities, and sometimes reindeer herding, for example, in the north of Siberia. That the modern technology has completely changed this way of living, for example, for the mineral exploitation that is carried out in these territories, especially for oil in the north of Russia, for example. And there are also scientific research bases studying glaciers, animals, or simply scientific, physical, or chemical uh, research carried out in these extreme conditions. And finally, our last landscape is the mountain one. This is a particular landscape as is not defined by the climate zone but just by the height. When we are over 2,500 meters high, we are on a mountain climate. The most famous is the Everest, but we can also mention the Alps in between Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and France, or the Andes in Chile, Argentina, Peru. And of course, the Himalaya with the Everest, which is the highest mountain in the world. These are the high mountain areas in the world located in the Great Mountain Ranges, and all of them, regardless of where they are, share some common characteristic. They are always very cold and they have a great amount of precipitation when we are going higher. So they are all around the world in altitudes over 2,500. This is a typical uh, climate graph from the high mountain. We can see how precipitation is very high. It's almost as high as and regular as in the equatorial climate, but the temperatures are much lower. The higher we are, the colder it gets and it rains more until we go to the mountain top, where it can be so high that not even the clouds reach it, so it has no rain. But in the rest of the mountain, it rains a lot and temperatures are cold. They do not have a great variation. The temperature mean is very cold and several months can be below zero. The higher we are, the colder it gets. So the temperatures are very low, the precipitation are abundant, the mountain tops are covered in snow because of this cold, and there are many rivers and lakes, especially the small springs that are born there because of the melting of the snow and the glaciers. So it's the origin of many rivers. And the vegetation is distributed in layers, in zones, depending on the height. On the top, sorry, on the bottom, we can find the regular vegetation of that area. If that area was typically a deciduous forest, they will find that. As it's colder because they are going higher, it's typical. They share some characteristic with the oceanic landscape. Then, when we are going higher, only bushes and meadows can grow there, like in the oceanic landscape. When we are higher, just grassland, and even there mosses and lichens like in the polar one, and finally just the bare rock. without any other vegetation. So we can find this forest on the mountains, but not on the highest part. And when we are higher, just pastures, grassland, usually employed by the people living there as a way to feed their animals. The only people living there are nomadic ones or people that live in the deep valleys of the mountain. And when we are on the top, they are just rock. Nothing can live there. So the vegetation depends on altitude, latitude, and other orientation. Of course, if we are in a colder area, we don't need to be so high to get this very cold temperature. If we are in a very hot zone, we will need to increase our height a lot until we reach this snow limit. And orientation, of course, the part of the mountain that receives more insolation will be hotter. So they have on the bottom this deciduous forest, then the coniferous forest, typical of the continental climate, then pastures when the forest can grow, then rocks when not even the pastures can grow, and we can find the top covered continuously in glaciers and snow. And of course, the human being is scarce in these territories. We can find nomadic herders like this one in the Tibet, or some sedentary ones in the valleys like this one in Nepal, the side of the Everest. Or the Inca civilization that reached very high on the Andes, for example, Machu Picchu. Nowadays, the mountains receive population especially because of tourism. It could be some tourists looking for new experience, such as the climbers that go to the Everest, or looking leisure activities, such as the skiers, like in the ski resorts in the Alps. And then can be used also for getting hydroelectrical energy, for example, with this dam in Canada. As they have deep valleys and strong rivers, they can stop them, put a dam, and use them to create energy. So traditionally, they have had livestock farming. As many forests grow there, they can have forestry, and because of the deep valleys and the multiple rivers, the hydroelectric production, and for the attraction of that area, the tourist activities in well communicated areas. Of course, it will be meaningless creating a resort in the middle of the Andes if there aren't roads or train lines or airports to reach that place. So with that, we have finished our unit, and these are the activities you have to do. You have to complete the following chart with the different landscape. You need to put the name here: equatorial, tropical, hot desert, Mediterranean, oceanic, continental, high mountains and polar, location, where is it, climate, how is the climate, temperatures and precipitation, how is the vegetation living there, and what kind of human activities are carried on that territories. You have this chart larger in the Google Drive. And you need to do an online test of Unit 6 and 7. Remember that this is not an exam, it's just a check and another activity, but it's important for you to do it. So thank you very much for watching, and if you have any question, anything to tell me, just write me and I'll try to answer as soon as possible. Do not forget working on your project and paying attention to it, as it will be an important part of your grade. Thank you very much.